The laughter echoed off the tile walls. That detail stays with everyone who was there that night. Not the confrontation itself, not what came after, but the laughter. How easy it was. How comfortable. The sound of two men who had never once laughed at the wrong person and paid for it. Until now. His name was Frank DeLuca. Head instructor. 12 years running the most respected karate dojo in the county, or so the banner above the entrance claimed in block letters that had faded just enough to look established rather than old. Frank had built that reputation carefully: tournament wins, a wall of student photographs, a waiting list for the junior program that parents mentioned at school pickups like a status marker. He was 44 years old. He was good at what he did. And he had developed, over years of being the most skilled man in every room he entered, a particular blindness that skill sometimes grows, the inability to recognize competence that doesn't announce itself. The janitor announced nothing. That was the problem. Walter Pruitt had been cleaning the DeLuca Academy of Martial Arts for 7 weeks. He came in at 9 p.m., after the last class cleared. He worked alone, methodically, mats first, then the changing rooms, then the lobby with its trophy cases and framed certificates and the photograph of Frank shaking hands with a state senator at some forgotten event. Walter moved through it all without comment, without curiosity, without any of the deferential chattiness that Frank had come to expect from service workers in his space. He was 64. Lean in the way of men who have never stopped moving. His face was weathered and specific, the kind of face that has seen enough weather to stop being surprised by it. His hands, when you noticed them, were disproportionately capable looking. The hands of a man who had built things and broken things and understood the difference. The night cleaning crew lead had hired him through a staffing agency. Frank had never asked questions. Clean floors were clean floors. He had not looked closely at Walter Pruitt. That would change. The first night it happened, Frank was running late grading. He sometimes stayed after close, paperwork, curriculum planning, the administrative sediment that accumulates around any business regardless of how physical its product. He was at his desk when Walter arrived. He heard the mop bucket wheels on the lobby tile, heard the quiet efficiency of someone who knew the work, and paid no further attention. Until his assistant instructor, Danny, arrived to pick up a forgotten bag. Danny was 26. Fast, talented, deeply invested in Frank's good opinion. He came in the side entrance, saw Walter in the lobby, and made a sound, a short exhale of amusement, that he didn't bother to suppress. Breaking a sweat there, old-timer? Walter didn't look up. Staying in shape? Danny continued, performing now, aware that Frank's office door was open. Mopping good cardio? Walter ran the mop under the trophy case with the patience of a man who had heard a great deal of noise in his life and had long since stopped organizing it into categories worth responding to. Frank appeared in the office doorway. Leaned against the frame. Looked at the scene with the comfortable authority of a man in his own building. Danny glanced at him, grinning. Invitation extended. Frank looked at Walter's back. At the gray shirt, the deliberate movement, the complete absence of reaction. Danny, he said. Not a reprimand. Something lighter than that. Danny laughed again, grabbed his bag, left. Frank watched Walter for another moment. Then he went back to his desk. He told himself he felt nothing about the exchange. That was not entirely true. The second incident had an audience. Friday nights, Frank ran an advanced sparring session that drew his best students, the ones who competed, the ones whose trophies were newest on the wall. 8, sometimes 10 of them, all skilled, all deeply conditioned to the social atmosphere Frank had built over 12 years. Respectful inside the dojo. Increasingly less so regarding anyone outside its hierarchy. The session ran long. By the time they filtered out it was nearly 10:30, and Walter had been waiting in the parking lot. This was his routine when classes ran over, patient, undemanding, before coming in to start. He came through the side door as the last 3 students were leaving. One of them, a 22-year-old named Brett who had won regionals twice and had recently developed the habit of treating those wins as a permanent character trait, held the door without quite holding it. Let it swing back as Walter's hands were full with the mop bucket. The bucket caught the door. Water sloshed. Brett didn't turn around. His 2 training partners laughed. Walter set the bucket down. Steadied it. Looked at the door. Then picked it back up and came through. Frank was still inside, coiling a training rope near the mat edge. He had seen it. He coiled the rope. Said nothing. Walter began setting up. "You need something?" Frank asked. The question was neutral on the surface. Beneath the surface it was not. "Just starting," Walter said. "Right." Frank looked at him a moment longer. "Try to be quiet." "I'm still working." "I'm always quiet," Walter said. Something about the way he said it, not defensively, not pointedly, just as simple fact, made Frank pause for a half-second. Then he went back to his rope. 3 weeks later, a man came into the dojo looking for Frank. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, between the children's class and the adult beginner session, a window when the lobby was empty except for Danny, who was updating the class schedule on the whiteboard. The man was somewhere in his late 50s, military straight posture, a face that disclosed nothing. He wore civilian clothes that fit the way civilian clothes fit on men who spent most of their lives in uniform, slightly wrong, slightly temporary. He asked for Frank by name. Danny pointed to the office. The man went in. The door didn't fully close. Danny, who was curious by nature and had no particular discipline about it, positioned himself near enough to catch fragments. He heard Frank say, "Can I help you?" He heard the visitor say something Danny couldn't make out. Then he heard Frank's voice change. Not dramatically. But it changed. The easy authority leaving it, replaced with something more careful. "Walter Pruitt," Frank said. Danny stopped pretending to update the whiteboard. The door opened 4 minutes later. The visitor left without looking at Danny. Frank stood in the office doorway. He stood there for a long time. Then he looked at Danny. "What time does Walter come in tonight?" he asked. 9, Danny said. Frank nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. What Frank DeLuca had just been told, in the quiet of his office by a man he would later learn was a retired colonel who had driven 2 hours specifically to make this visit, was the shape of a life he had looked at for 7 weeks and seen nothing of. Walter Pruitt had enlisted at 18. He had served for 26 years. Not in a single specialty, Walter had been identified early as someone whose physical and psychological profile warranted a particular investment. He had trained under disciplines that Frank, as a martial artist, would have recognized by name and received with something close to reverence had he encountered them in any other context. He had been, for the better part of 2 decades, an instructor himself. Not in a dojo with banners and trophies. In facilities that don't appear on maps, training men who don't appear on rosters, in methods that don't appear in any curriculum Frank had ever taught or studied. He had retired at 44. Had taken civilian work without fanfare. Had moved through jobs the way he moved through rooms, quietly, efficiently, without advertisement. The colonel had driven 2 hours because he had heard, through a network of men who kept informal track of each other, that Walter was working a janitorial job at a martial arts school. And that the atmosphere at that school had become uncomfortable in specific ways that the colonel felt Walter deserved to know had been noticed. He had wanted Frank to know that he knew. Frank understood the message. The question was what to do with it. The confrontation, and it is only called that because no other word quite fits, though it contained almost no movement and lasted less than 90 seconds, happened on a Thursday. Frank had spent 2 days constructing a posture of normalcy. He had said nothing to Danny. Nothing to Brett. He had watched the clock move toward 9 p.m. on Thursday with the particular dread of a man who has realized, too late, the dimensions of a mistake. Walter came in at 9. Frank was waiting in the lobby. This was unusual enough that Walter paused. He looked at Frank. Looked at the lobby. Processed the arrangement. "Evening," he said. "Walter." Frank gestured toward the mat room. "Can we talk for a minute?" Walter set down his equipment. "Follow." They stood on the mat, Frank in his training clothes, Walter in his gray work shirt, the overhead light steady and indifferent above them. The trophy wall to one side. The photograph of the state senator on the other. Frank had prepared something to say. He had rehearsed it. He found, standing there, that it was completely useless. "I owe you an apology," he said. The rehearsed version had more architecture than that. This was what came out instead. Walter looked at him. Said nothing. "The way my students have spoken to you," Frank said. "The way I've allowed. That was wrong." He paused. "I've been told some things about your background that I should have." "You shouldn't need to be told," Walter said. Frank stopped. "You shouldn't need to know what someone did before," Walter continued, his voice even, unhurried, "to treat them decently." The room was very quiet. Frank absorbed this. "No," he said. "You're right." Walter held his gaze for a moment and had waited to. Not hostile. Not forgiving either, not yet, and not performed. Just honest. Then he reached down, picked up his mop. "I've got floors to do," he said. Frank called Danny that night at 11. He was direct. He described what the colonel had told him about Walter, and he watched Danny's end of the call go very quiet. Then he described what Walter had said on the mat. He told Danny that both pieces of information were important. But that Danny should think carefully about which one actually mattered. Danny was quiet for a long time. "I'll apologize to him Monday," he said. "You'll apologize to him tonight," Frank said. "He's still there." Brett was harder. Brett had the particular impermeability of young men whose talent has shielded them from consequence for long enough that they've stopped believing consequences exist. Frank had seen it before, in students, in competitors, occasionally in the mirror during years he didn't revisit with pride. He pulled Brett aside after the following Saturday session. He told him about Walter. Brett's first response was a version of impressive, which told Frank everything about where the problem lived. "That's not the point," Frank said. "I know, but..." "That is not the point," Frank said again, slower. Brett looked at him. "The point," Frank said, "is that you treated a man as less than you without any information except that he was older than you and doing different work. And you were wrong about him. But you would have been wrong either way." Brett said nothing. "I was wrong either way," Frank added. "And meant it." Walter finished his contract with the agency 6 weeks later. On his last night, Frank was there when he arrived. The lobby was clean, Frank had done it himself, which Walter noticed without commenting on. Frank had a plain envelope on the front desk. "Severance," he said. "From the school. Not the agency." Walter looked at it. "That's not necessary," he said. "I know," Frank said. Walter picked up the envelope. He looked around the lobby, at the trophies, the photographs, the faded banner. The space that Frank had spent 12 years filling with evidence of his own authority. "You've built something real here," Walter said. Frank looked at him. Surprised, maybe. "You should be careful," Walter continued, "what you let in the door." He paused. "The students learn from all of it. Not just what you teach on the mat." He set the mop in its bucket. Gave the lobby one last slow look. "Floor's clean," he said. And left. Frank stood in the empty lobby for a long time after the lights in the parking lot swept across the window and disappeared. He looked at the trophy wall. At the photograph of himself, arm raised, mid-celebration. He thought about 12 years of building. What he'd built carefully. What he'd let accumulate without attention. The difference between those two things. He went to his office. Sat down. Started writing. Not a curriculum. Not an apology. A set of standards, for the school, for his students, for the atmosphere he would maintain from here. The things that would and would not be permitted inside these walls, regardless of who was doing what work, regardless of what anyone had or hadn't accomplished. He wrote for an hour. When he was done, he read it back. He thought about Walter Pruitt. He pinned the paper to the wall above his desk where he would see it every morning. Then he turned off the light and locked up. The floors were clean. The rest was his work to do. If this one landed, if you've ever watched quiet competence get dismissed by loud confidence and felt something tighten in your chest waiting for the correction, this channel is built for that feeling. Subscribe. There are more of these men. More of these moments. The next story is already written.